So I hope everyone had a good break. Yu and I were just talking about how our children were still in school, so we didn't really get to do anything too big, but chilled out around the house and had some fun that way. So that was nice. Hopefully when my daughter has spring break in April, we'll be able to do something on a weekend there. Maybe go to Dinosaur National Monument, because it should be pretty good temperatures, not too hot yet. All right, so we've got today chapter 9, and then chapter 10 Smart Book will be Thursday. My guess is for chapter 9 we will hopefully get through all the physical development material today, and then finish up with the cognitive development material on chapter 9, and then start chapter 10 on March 18th. We do have a little bit more packed because of spring break for this second unit. So we've got chapter 9, 10 has essentially 2 days to cover it, 11 has a couple days, and 12. So hopefully we can get everything. There's a lot of examples, and I think sometimes a lot more relevance to the adolescence chapters, because a lot of students have just left adolescence, or are just feeling, maybe even not feeling yet like they've left adolescence, as we get into early adulthood as well. So a lot of relevant things, hopefully a lot of memories or examples that you can bring up into the classroom. So we are kind of packing it in, but if you have examples, if you have questions, definitely ask them. That always makes the class better. So before we get into the actual lecture slides themselves, let's see the grades on, well, the average grades on the exam. So everyone did really great. So I'm really happy to see this average score is so much higher than for exam 1. You can see we've got, I mean, it's kind of hard because it's like light blue on white, not really great graphics design, but this is just what it spits out to me. So you can see we've got a big group here where we've got about from 80% to 100%. So that's a good range. That's where I like most of the students to be. So if your scores are over here in the 50s and 60s, let me know and we can work to do better on the next exam, see what things you were struggling with. Maybe it was internet connection dying, or maybe it was that you were just really confused with some of the topics. So definitely reach out to me if you're these students down here, or if you just want to improve your grade in general and want some more study tips, things like that. But yeah, great job, everyone. My other class also got really similarly 87% on average for that exam. So questions about that, or questions you think I should look at to see if you felt like they were coded wrong, maybe just put them up in the chat, whichever question, or like what the question was about, and then after class I can go and check out those questions and then fix any grades that need to be fixed. So put those in the chat if that is the case. How do we read Unicheck? I'm not sure what you're referring to. I think, oh, for the question papers. Okay, there should be, this might be actually my fault. Let me see if I have it programmed so that you can see it. So when you go to any question paper, actually maybe let's do the other class. So not your class. Courses, this one. So the Unicheck, the purpose of the Unicheck is essentially it's a Turnitin program to see if you are plagiarizing anything. So when you submit your file, near your file, you should see some kind of number like this. So it should be green, yellow, red, depending on the percentage. Let's actually find one with a higher percentage. 4.3, that's not too high. All right, 14.7, that's higher, so we'll be able to see some things here. So this is essentially your similarity score. And if you click just on that percent, it should take you in to see this report. So I just clicked on that. You should be able to see a report almost exactly like this. It might look a little bit differently formatted, but here in the document, you should see things like this, things highlighted. So when you click on those highlights, you can see, oh, this came from this article. So that's telling me or you that, hey, these specific words in this specific order look like they are copied and pasted. And so here it looks like this student just copied and pasted the link to the article. So they might just have the incorrect formatting for their paper. So here in the paper, we can see they have a quote here. So it's in quotation marks, so that's great. But one thing that they're missing is the in-text citation right here. So they'll lose a couple points on that, but this is not plagiarism because they are trying to cite it. They're not passing this off as their own work. They might have made a mistake in their citation, and that's what you want to check for. So Unicheck or Turnitin checks for words in order that are similar to anything on the web. Student papers that have been turned in at other universities, research articles. So it makes sense that this direct quote from this article is highlighted because Unicheck checked that. So you should be able to see a report like this. And what I want you to use this for is to go through and say, oh, well, this blue part here, it looks like this entire sentence is highlighted. And so you should check and say, okay, did I actually cite this part? So you can check, oh, this came from the same article. So what it looks like this student did was take a whole sentence from that article and just copy and paste it into their paper. You can go into other sources or other pieces in your paper that come from that site. So for example, this should be in quotation marks as well. I would recommend a student don't put a direct quote for the intro to your paper, like as the first sentence, but right here, a definition of something would make sense maybe. Right here, they're jumping into some statistics, so that makes sense because if you want to state a statistic and you don't know how to describe it in your own words, I totally understand that, so putting that in quotation marks. But this here should also be in quotation marks. And this down, where was that second example? This should also be in quotation marks. So both, this one was incorrectly cited. This one I'll take a few more points off than this one because they are trying to cite it. They're saying, hey, this is a direct quote, so they're acknowledging that. So that's what I want you to use the Unicheck for, is to make sure that you have cited everything. Because as you're writing, you might have copied and pasted something into your notes, and then when you go back to your notes to finish writing the paper, you might not realize, oh, this was actually a direct quote from the paper. So you might mistakenly put it in your paper and turn it in that way. So this gives you a chance to look through and then make any changes. It should give you your report within about 5 minutes. Sometimes it's immediate, but if the system and their servers are overloaded, it can take a little bit more time. So you can check that report, or you should be able to check that report and then make any corrections and resubmit it. So that's what I want you to use that for. And that helps me see if you're citing correctly. Like as I read it, I'll be able to pick out that, oh, the way that's written is not matching the way they're citing and writing other things in the paper. So I can tell that way too. But yeah, that's what I want you to do in case you've missed something. So does that answer questions with the Unicheck system? Hopefully that's a little more clear now. It's funny, I've got like little dots of light highlighting me right here. The papers are not graded. No, I was thinking of doing that during spring break, but instead I actually took a break and didn't grade them. So I'll grade them. I'll be starting grading them this week, so hopefully they get finished grading by the end of this week, but it might be a little bit longer than that. It just depends on how much feedback I end up giving to each paper. So if there's a lot of things to say, it'll take a little bit longer. If there's fewer things to say, it'll go a little bit quicker. So no one has grades for it yet. And do check if you cannot see your Unicheck report. Let me know, because that's a problem in the settings that I'll have to go and change for the next one. All right, well, let's continue on with chapter 9, and we will get into adolescence. So in between about 1890 through 1920, even for researchers, the idea of adolescence, or the main ideas surrounding adolescence, was that it's a time of storm and stress. That adolescents are stressed out, that they're going through lots of challenges, through lots of troubles, and we can actually see this is kind of a layperson idea as well, feeling like adolescence is kind of a really troubled time. So that probably came from just the general population's attitude, the general population of adults' attitude towards adolescence, and it bled into the research. A little bit later, in 1950 through 1970, adolescent research started to do a better job, as other areas of psychology started to do a better job, looking into more diverse ethnicities. So before this, almost all research was done on young men. So after this, young white men. And after this, they started bringing in more ethnicities, more women into the studies. So getting a better picture of what adolescence looks like among more people, essentially. So right here, during this time, a lot of adolescents were more civically engaged than had been seen previously. So this kind of contrasted with the storm and stress view, the idea that, well, they are stressed, but they're actually trying to do something positive for people. So whether the researchers thought it was positive or they shouldn't be doing this, they tried not to let that factor into their decision. But they could see that they were being definitely more civically engaged. They were trying to do something about the Vietnam War. And then so in the 70s, the researchers did a lot better job at bringing in a lot more young women versus just young boys and young men exclusively to research studies. So getting a better picture, getting more ethnicities. So honestly, this is not that long ago, so it is sad that it took this long, but that is the case. So with this, a lot of original research questions came from common stereotypes of adolescence. A lot of the first theories or ideas about development of adolescence also came from stereotypes. So what are some stereotypes of adolescence? What are some things that you've heard people say about adolescence, or even think yourself about adolescence? Maybe just type them in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand as well. Any stereotypes? That's a good one. They're rebellious. Adolescents are rebellious. That fits right well in with the storm and stress view of adolescence. Good. Angsty, so maybe emotional, maybe not regulating their emotions well. Maybe higher drama for adolescents. I don't know if all of those are good synonyms for angsty, but what is the common view of what are adolescents the most concerned with when they're in adolescence? Or the stereotype of what are adolescents most concerned with? So throwing tantrums like kids. So adolescents, I think this is an answer to my question, popularity. So they're really concerned with their popularity and how other people see them. They're really egocentric. They might be throwing tantrums. Yeah, a lot of these concerned with their self-image and approval of others. They think they're very independent. Yeah, that's a good stereotype. They think they are. Very good. So yeah, I think all of us have a pretty good idea of these general stereotypes of adolescence. And that's where a lot of the first research questions came from, is looking to see, well, why are adolescents so egocentric? Or why are they so rebellious? Or why are they doing unsafe sexual behaviors? So that's one of the other big ones, is that adolescents are so preoccupied with sex. So that's another thing that is a concern to general adults in the population. So, but all of these are really good examples of the common stereotypes of adolescence. And so that's where the research started, is why are they doing these negative things? Why are they throwing tantrums? Why are they so angsty? Those kinds of things started off the research. And so in doing that, we started to learn more about those processes, about what's actually happening. And then as research methods have improved, we've learned more and more and expanded and connected concepts together. So another example is adolescents think they know it all. And I think we've seen this Dunning-Kruger effect in the past. So that is another stereotype of adolescence. But interestingly, more recently, so in maybe the last 10 or 15 years, there's a movement in developmental research that's called Positive Youth Development Movement. And so it focuses on these 5 C's. And we might have brought up these 5 C's in the past when we were talking about middle childhood. But the 5 C's are competence, confidence, connection, character, and caring. And so we'll kind of touch on those as we continue on. So research has really moved from that. My main point in showing you this is to show that research has really moved from that storm and stress focused on these stereotypes. Why are adolescents so negative, and why are things so terrible? Why are they making bad or risky decisions? To now seeing, well, even though, well, maybe they do have some capacity for independence. Maybe they do have positive benefits that they could provide to society. Maybe we should help adolescents get more confidence, be more connected with people, be more caring, have more character, or have more competence in a lot of ways. So competence, I think you can probably see how that connects to like self-efficacy that we talked about in middle and late childhood. So just continuing that on into adolescence, there's a lot more opportunities, especially as you continue on through adolescence, for getting more competent with a lot of different things. So that's where the research has moved more recently. There's still obviously focuses, and actually most of the funding still now today is in sort of negative things that adolescents might get into, drugs, alcohol, risky sexual behaviors. There's still a lot of funding for those areas, but there's more funding now than there was before for these kind of positive outcomes, or looking at not just those negative possibilities, but also the potential positives that adolescents can give or do to the world. So remember those stereotypes as we go through, because it does really influence the research that we're going to talk about today. All right, so adolescence in reality is not just a time of rebellion, pathology, crisis, or deviance. In actuality, there's not as much storm and stress and crisis and pathology or rebellion as adults, we'll say people my age or older than me, maybe my parents' age as well, think about adolescence. Reality, adolescence is a time where they're evaluating things in their own life, themselves, their friends, the world around them, seeing where they might fit. So they're making commitments to different things in life. They're trying to make different choices and finding their place in the world. So this is some of the primary drivers of what adolescents are doing socio-emotionally, within their different contexts. So these are actually some of the main drivers of adolescent behavior. At the broad scale, if we look at development across time, you can obviously look at, say, a risky behavior in a smaller context, but is probably part of a bigger context of trying to evaluate, hey, is this, and making these choices, is this a good thing for me to do? Should I be standing up on the roof of my friend's Suburban as he drives through a cornfield? Probably not, but an adolescent I knew was trying that and making that choice off in Indiana. There's a lot of cornfields in Indiana. All right, so let's jump into puberty, some of the physical development characteristics that lead to some of, well, these stereotypes, as well as other aspects of what we know about adolescence now. So puberty is generally when most researchers consider the beginning of adolescence, so when that starts. So it can be pretty early, or for any individual, it might be a little later. So we'll talk about that first. So the brain and neuroendocrine processes are really the beginning of puberty, and that happens early on in adolescence. And this is before you see any physical changes in an adolescent. So you might take a 13-year-old who doesn't show any primary or secondary sexual characteristics changing yet, but you might be able to see some brain or neuroendocrine processes that have already started. So their puberty has actually started, but there's not things that you can see from the outside. So if their primary care physician took a look at them, they wouldn't know yet. I mean, they would suspect, because they know this too, but they wouldn't say, hey, puberty has started. So with this, puberty is a whole process, not a single event. It's a process that spans a couple of years generally, and it generally occurs the onset. So this brain and neuroendocrine processes generally starts between ages of about 9 and 16. So you could start these brain processes really early on around age 9, or for any individual, it might be later on at about 16. So the onset is generally programmed into our genes. So if you look at, say, your parents and your ancestors, essentially, you might be able to have a better idea of about when you'll go through puberty, but it's not only dependent on our genes. So we'll talk about that in a second. So here we can see some of the physical characteristics you can actually see, like of a primary care physician. took a look, they might see, oh, you've had a growth spurt. So that's what this one is. Menarche, which is the onset of the first period. Breast growth. So breast growth, here this graph, I'll try to explain it. So this is the average onset, and this is around the, so on average, most are having breast growth, the initial stages of breast growth in here, but it also has a wide standard deviation. So we just showed our grades for our second exam, had a pretty small standard deviation. Everybody was pretty clumped together. So for breast growth, that standard deviation is quite large. So it can happen very early or very late. So here we can see that with males as well. So with that, you can also see the ages here. We've got some things starting as early as 8, 9, and 10, but for males, about 10, 11, and 12 are about the earliest you might see changes. So early onset for males is like 10 or 11. Early onset for females is like 8, 9, 10. So with that being said, the timing of puberty now, in current time, is earlier than in previous generations. You can look at the median age, so about the, not quite the average, but the middle number for the age of when menarche, for when that first period starts, decreasing over essentially the last century. Yeah, that was a little tongue twister. So with this, most of this is caused by genetics, but it's also affected by epigenetic factors. So there are things in our environment that might be pulling that age a little closer. Some examples are height and weight. So a high weight will generally tend to be correlated with menarche earlier. Higher BMI is correlated with menarche happening earlier. Obesity, so obesity is related to BMI and high weight as well. So having someone who is obese means it's a lot more likely that, especially for a woman, to start these processes, both the brain neuroendocrine processes and the physical developmental features you might see earlier on. So stress and conflict as well are correlated with earlier onset. They actually seem to be causal factors as well. So that's some of the reason that we see puberty starting earlier. And with that, we talked about brain development in late childhood, which goes into about ages 10, even up to 12. So with that, the brains of a 10 and 12-year-old are quite a bit different still than a 16 or 17-year-old. So there are some potential consequences for having earlier or later development socio-emotionally as well. So how might this early onset, so for a girl, let's say, who is showing primary or secondary sexual characteristics at age 10 versus, say, 13, how might that affect the lives of those girls going through puberty early? What might be happening with them and their friends or the other people around them if they notice them going through these kinds of physical changes? So we've got a comment in the chat. It can be kind of embarrassing. Yeah, a lot of time for girls that are going through puberty earlier on, that they're the first one in their group of peers, they often report a lot of embarrassment or feeling uncomfortable about their bodies more than their peers who haven't started puberty. So another good comment here, other people might see them as more sexually mature and treat them differently. Yeah, absolutely. This is a real big problem when we see them being even involved in relationships with older people, whether it's 14-year-olds or 16-year-olds or even older than that. So people can and often do see them because physically they look more mature, but their brain development is still at the same place, right? So with that, they might ask them to be involved in situations that are a little more mature than their brain maturity level. So we'll talk about that. Period horror stories, yeah, that can be very embarrassing. So, and they'll feel different from their peers. So these are the two main things: the peer rejection or acceptance, and then also initiation of risky sexual behaviors is oftentimes correlated with an early onset of puberty because people are treating them as more sexually mature. So, how might this be different for boys who are maturing a little earlier? How do you think their peers are going to react to that for early maturing boys? I guess we'll say males. Yeah, very good. We've got a comment here. The early maturing male will be applauded for that. They, rather than being embarrassed in their group of friends, the early maturing male will generally be seen as higher status now than their peers. So they are generally applauded for that. So really good. So that is one really big difference in the socio-emotional um, connections there. So if you're embarrassed, if you are, say, seeking the approval of others and you're not getting that, if you're getting attention from people who are older, that might lead you to be more likely or less likely to do certain risky behaviors. If your peers are really happy and excited, if you are, say, growing muscles before all your other peers for a male, then you might be the most popular. So a really big difference there. All right, so with that, early maturing girls, because of these things, are more likely to smoke, drink, have eating disorders, have early dating and early sexual experiences, and we'll talk about some of the risk factors for that later. They're more likely to have depression and view themselves negatively. So it's not a great deal for early maturing girls. For early maturing boys, just like we just talked about, they view themselves more positively. They have more successful peer relationships. They're generally seen as higher status, and they focus more on their physical status than their academic and career development. So that can be a big negative if they're maturing earlier and they're focused on, well, hey, I'm stronger and bigger than my peers. Maybe I'll focus on, say, sports. Maybe I'll play sports because I can do better because physically I'm more capable, and then ignoring academic and career development can be a negative consequence there. So with that, having late maturation, so having puberty onset near the end of that average time, is generally a worse outcome for boys. So for males, early maturation tends to be more positive. Late maturation tends to have more negative outcomes, more negative view of body image, more rejection from peers because they still look or seem younger. Maybe their voice still hasn't changed, that kind of thing. So worse, more negative outcomes for females with early onset, better outcomes for males for early onset, better outcomes for females with later onset, worse outcomes for males with later onset. Hopefully I didn't mix up any of those words there and say the opposite of what I was meaning. So with this, both boys and girls, generally all adolescents, are preoccupied with their body image throughout puberty. So with this, girls in general are more dissatisfied with their body image as puberty progresses, and boys are more satisfied on average as puberty progresses. I think we can see some of the same things with peer relationships happening there. So, and over the course of adolescence, on average, body image becomes more positive. So if we look at body image on average, putting all genders and all sexes together, we see a general upward trend. So with this, health enhancing behaviors, so things like working out, doing exercise, being physically active, are related to more positive body image. All right, so let's talk about brain development in puberty. We mentioned that puberty really starts from neuroendocrine processes in the brain, and then you see physical changes like breast growth or hair growth, things like that. But a lot of what's happening during puberty is happening in the brain, not just the start of it, but a lot of other aspects. So there's a lot of points here in this video that I want to watch the whole thing for. And we'll talk about some of them right now, and then hopefully you'll remember like the aspect of sleep in the video that we'll come back to a little bit later today. So let's watch this at a little faster speed. If it's too fast for you, definitely let me know and I can slow it down.
Is hard, and so is living with one, I'm told. No human gets to escape this moody, angsty, confusing phase, and interestingly, such an extended adolescence is unique to humans. Other animals grow up a lot faster than we do. And you may think our teen years are just about streamlining bodies for baby making, but as it turns out, the storms of sex hormones that we associate with the teenage years are only a small part of what's really going on in the teenage body. Most of the action, it turns out, is happening in the brain. Until fairly recently, we thought that the brain finished the nuts and bolts of its development by the time we started kindergarten. But really, right as puberty rolls in, it undergoes massive remodeling. This amounts to several years of neural growing pains, as well as the other more visible growth that's going on all over your body. So take heart, whether you're going through it now or about to go through it, or count yourself among the veterans of that turbulent decade. Know that the result of the teen years is a stronger, faster, more sophisticated brain. There's someone who told me that 20 years ago. Let's start with that obvious scapegoat of adolescent anguish, hormones. That word itself is kind of a lazy shorthand that people use to describe the chemicals that some of our glands excrete that can affect our behavior. But the fact is, hormones have all kinds of jobs that have nothing to do with where you grow hair, or what turns you on, or whether you feel glum for no apparent reason. Hormones keep your heart beating and your body hydrated, and they make your organs grow and make you grow bone and muscle and skin. What people actually mean when they talk about teenage hormones are sex hormones. And yes, puberty involves a whole series of sex hormone storms, the first of which actually kicks in before you're out of primary school. That's when the adrenal glands start secreting androgens, which trigger the growth and activity of the skin's sebaceous glands, making skin more oily. Soon enough, more apocrine or sweat glands get activated, increasing body odor. Then comes the wave of hormonal agents that start activating the gonads. For boys, this influx of luteinizing hormones from the pituitary gland get testosterone brewing in the testes, and suddenly that guy has up to 50 times more testosterone than he did before puberty. This also changes the shape of the male body, promoting hair growth and building up lean muscle mass, just as the increased presence of estrogen in girls rearranges the deposition of their fat, stimulating the growth of breasts. Humans are actually lucky to experience the craziness of puberty only once. Many other animals undergo multiple similarly intense hormonal rodeos as they enter sexually active periods, sometimes called the rut or heat, every new breeding season. Some male species completely stop eating during their breeding period because they're just that sex crazed. And yet, all that said, teens are far less ruled than their hormones than you might think. There are other factors at play here. For example, your favorite moody teen may be by turns punchy, angry, depressed, or in a zombie-like fog because of their chronic lack of sleep.
So, this is one of the points that I want to make within this section on adolescence is, yes, there are these hormones, there are these neurological changes that are happening, hormone changes leading to other processes. So it's a whole system that brain and neuroendocrine processes start the development and production of more hormones in different parts of the body. But not everything is dependent on that. Some of it is dependent on also the wiring up of the brain, and we'll get to that in a minute. But also some behaviors are in response to sleep and melatonin and the circadian rhythms changing in adolescence. So it's not all just down to puberty and hormones and things like that. So, and it's also not as stormy and stressful and bad as the stereotypes that we've seen in the past. So let's talk about sleep a little bit.
Is vital to everyone, but it's especially important for kids and teens because it's during sleep that your pituitary gland releases an essential growth hormone necessary for development. A normal sleep cycle driven by circadian rhythm is regulated by the daytime release of cortisol, which helps you wake up, and melatonin, which helps you wind down when it gets dark. But this biology of sleep timing changes as we age, and as puberty begins, teens' sleep clocks get pushed back. Most adults start oozing melatonin around 10 p.m.-ish, but one study showed that teenagers don't start producing melatonin until closer to 1 a.m. This may be because puberty's hormonal frenzy is stalling the release of melatonin, and could partly explain why so many teens stay up late, energized by the night, but have a really hard time rolling out of bed with the alarm. Of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg deal, since watching reruns of The Simpsons and playing Call of Duty late in the night continues to stimulate the brain, which may further delay the release of melatonin. Still, some researchers are starting to advocate for pushing back high school start times in the morning in the hopes of having more focused students. So we got sex hormones changing the bodies and a lack of sleep to contend with, but increasing evidence suggests that there is something much bigger at work that's making teenagers so teenagery. Their brains. It turns out that brains actually take longer than we thought to fully mature. I don't mean physical size. Our brains are already about 95% full size by the time we're just 6, but more in the sense of the connections inside the brain. Adults for the most part, know how to make decisions by evaluating choices and weighing consequences. They do this with their prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for controlling impulses and emotions and forming judgments. Its neurons chat with the neurons in other regions of the brain responsible for, say, memory or movement through synapses. Thing is, teenage brains don't quite work like this yet. The prefrontal cortex may not be fully developed until your mid-20s, and teen synapses, those...
So when we say that the prefrontal cortex is not quite developed yet, hopefully I've repeated this enough times that you remember, these are things like completely connected up, so a lot of dendrites and axon branches to other areas of the brain, as well as the myelination. So it's not that those neurons aren't there, they're there, but they're still connecting up, doing more of a job at connecting up. And there's a big jump in that kind of activity towards later adolescence, as well as the finishing up of that myelination in early adulthood.
Lines of communication are still growing and specializing. They're also slow. As an adolescent brain keeps developing, its axons, the long tail-like parts of the neurons that transmit signals to other neurons, become more and more insulated by a fatty layer called the myelin sheath. This padding greatly increases the cell's transmission speed, and while it helps adults make faster decisions, it isn't fully formed in teens. These changes occur slowly, beginning at the back of the brain, where the oldest and most fundamental brain parts reside, and slowly working its way forward to the more advanced and complicated brain bits. The prefrontal cortex is the last to be hooked up and shaped. So it's important to keep in mind that just because your favorite teenagers stayed up until sunrise binge watching The Walking Dead the night before an exam, it doesn't mean they're dumb or lazy. Their brains are just literally finishing being built. But at the same time, because all this brain building is just starting to peak, this is also when the brain starts getting thinned out. You actually start losing connections that you don't use enough in a process called synaptic pruning, which has led to a theory that this is kind of a use it or lose it phase. Meaning, adolescence could be an especially important time to use your brain, play an instrument, engage in sports, write poetry, learn a language. Because by doing these things, you're helping hardwire those synapses and giving your brain topiary a lovely, lasting shape. Whereas if you're sitting around all day playing Candy Crush, those will be the connections that survive, which you don't need. This shaping of the teen brain manifests.
So this is one of the aspects of plasticity that we've talked about, and one of the reasons that so much more research is on now positive youth development, helping encourage that kind of connecting up and that expanding talents and abilities and capacities, and realizing that adolescents are very capable of doing a lot more than we might have thought 30 or 40 years ago. And so doing things in schools, changing school curriculums, or changing communities, or changing their environment to encourage them to be able to do more so they can gain those capacities.
Itself in other ways too, like in teenage attitudes. A group of scientists at the McLean Hospital in Massachusetts once hooked up a group of adults and a group of teens to MRI devices and then asked them to identify a series of expressions on photographs of adult faces. Interestingly, while adults correctly identified one expression as fear, the teenagers thought the faces showed anger, surprise, or shock. They weren't registering subtlety as well. Not only that, but the MRI images showed that adults and teens responded with different parts of their brains. Adults used the reasonable prefrontal cortex, while the teens mostly used the gut reaction emotional amygdala, located farther back in the brain. Results like these might help explain why teenagers seem to experience frequent mood swings. For one, they tend to react quickly from the emotional part of their brain without running those reactions by the more rational frontal cortex, and two, it could be that they're just misreading expressions and therefore the intentions behind them. The frontal cortex also helps people relate to and understand each other, and you can imagine what happens when concern is misjudged as anger or worry as disappointment. The Fresh Prince has an entire song about it. But the truth is, as much as parents just don't understand, teens don't always understand either. When the emotional amygdala and the more rational cortex aren't fully hooked up yet, that can make it hard for teenagers to productively work through emotions. This kind of reactionary, impulsive behavior may also lead to more risk-taking. Adolescence is the time when we're most likely to experiment with whatever booze, drugs, or toad licking is available, and unfortunately, it's also the time our developing brains are most vulnerable to lasting effects. Studies have shown that teens are more likely to become addicted to drugs and alcohol than adults, partly because their brains are more attuned to their reward centers. While the teenage prefrontal cortex is still developing, their nucleus accumbens, or pleasure and reward zone, forms early on. Neuroimaging studies have shown that when presented with a big potential reward, teen brains light up way more than kids or adults' brains. But if the reward was small, teen brains hardly fired at all. So basically, give an adolescent a pat on the back, and you'll get a shrug. Give them a hot date or a winning goal, and their brains light up like Vegas. This, of course, does not always result in great judgment. A jacked-up, thrill-seeking impulse combined with an exquisite pang of peer pressure, plus a new driver's license, new sex parts, and access to substances experiences can lead to some not good results. But still, this long and sometimes tedious remodeling process that our bodies go through in the teenage years isn't all bad. Many scientists have pointed out that our delayed adolescence lets our brains keep their flexibility longer, which, yeah, may make teens a little slow, but also more adaptable as they prepare for the adult world. In this way, you can see teen impulsiveness as boldness or independent thinking, and moodiness as a source of newfound empathy, and excitability as passion. Which means there's a lot of awesome energy floating around out there ready to decrease all kinds of world suck. Thanks for watching this SciShow.
So hopefully, even just from that video, you can see some of the research, how a lot of these stereotypes led us to research, well, why are teens so this way or that way? And it helped us realize, well, the reasons behind that, and then how it's connected to other things, and then see that, well, there's a lot of capacities that adolescents have. So that's essentially the general pathway the field of development has taken in researching adolescence. All right, so let's talk about the limbic system. That's that very core middle, maybe core is a bad word, but like the very middle center of your brain, where we've got the limbic system, amygdala, corpus callosum, and so this is where a lot of the emotion and reward centers are housed. There are more in other areas of the brain as well, but these are where some of the primary ones are. So they are finishing their myelination early on in adolescence. So by 12 or 13, these areas should be fully myelinated, ready to process things faster, ready to process things better. You've also now had 12 years or so of reading emotions, experiencing emotions, so you can recognize emotions a little better. Obviously not perfectly yet, as we heard in that video. But the limbic system is responsible for a lot of the things that we see in adolescent behavior. So later on in adolescence, we see a lot of these dendrite connections between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. So adolescents who are having their amygdala and their limbic system fully wired up, you could say. It's getting fully wired up, fully insulated by that myelin sheath. So it's working faster, working better. And then it's not fully wired up and fully insulated to the prefrontal cortex until about 23. So it might be a little bit different for any individual. So again, like a bell curve, the average is 23. It could be as early as 21 or as late as 25. So with this, the big key takeaway here is that adolescents are feeling emotions, more emotions, so a wider variety of different emotions, and stronger emotions than at any time in their life. Their brain is able to process those emotions now as an adult would feel them, but they still don't have the emotion regulation capacities of an adult. So this leads to, like they said, risk-taking, risky sexual behaviors, things like standing on top of your friend's Suburban as they drive through a cornfield, that kind of risky behaviors as well. I don't know why that one's stuck in my head. I did other risky behaviors, but I always remember the friend that, like, it was like right after high school got out, and there was a cornfield right next to the high school. So I lived in a kind of rural place at that point. And they decided to show off and climb on top of their friend's Suburban and drive through someone's cornfield. Hopefully it was a cornfield of someone they knew, because they destroyed a lot of corn doing that. But my guess is it wasn't someone that they knew. But yeah, that one's in my head right now. Anyway, so a lot of research in the past and even currently covers adolescent sexuality, looks at, well, why do adolescents do risky sexual behaviors? What are the potential outcomes from early or later sexual interactions? That kind of thing. So let's do that. Definitely a lot of important things to cover here, but I might speed through a few things quickly. So a lot of research, especially traditionally, focuses on pregnancy, STIs, STDs, so in kind of negative consequences for adolescents. Adolescents are often very negatively stereotyped in regards to sexuality. So it's really interesting, actually, that all societies, so across the world, are really attentive or concerned with adolescent sexuality. They really don't want adolescents to be too sexually active or engaged with each other in sexual activities, which now as an adult I find really funny. It's like, well, you've just been an adolescent, you kind of know what it's like, but also the fear of the kind of negative outcomes. But adolescent sexuality is a really normal part of human development. That's when that sexual development is really happening and kicking into high gear and getting ready for baby making. So it can lead to risky behaviors, can lead to poor relations with peers or positive relations with peers, but we can take the good, healthy parts of human sexuality and try to reduce the kind of risk factors around it as well. So with this, developing sexual identity is more than just sexual feelings and attraction. Adolescents, when they are developing their sexual identity, they're testing out intimacy with other people, so that sharing of things with others. They're trying to start managing their sexual behavior and regulating that. You're trying to regulate their emotions at the same time, try out different roles in relationships. So it's the same thing as identity development. And we haven't actually dove into identity development in a lot of depth yet. That'll come in the next couple chapters. But this is kind of the main key. In childhood, you've got your self-concepts, and then early to mid-adolescence, you have the different contexts that you're living in, your school, your family, your peers. You look for consistency in your behavior and who you are, and you test out different roles in relation to your identity. And then by about age 18 to 25 is generally a first time people settle on, this is my identity. So it can happen a little earlier, generally not much earlier than 14. And this is for identity generally. You might figure out sexual identity a little earlier than that, though. So with this, physical factors, body, puberty, hormones, but also social factors. So what are the peer norms around you? If you are maturing early, does that mean that you have attention from peers that are older? So now your peer group is older. So what are their norms versus your previous peers? Peer norms like the frequency that they're having sex, whether they're using protection or not. That's important for risky sexual behaviors. And so those are things that you can work on in a community or in a school kind of context to make it more the norm to use protection or to have safe sex practices. So the culture as well that someone is in is really affects their sexual behavior as well. And then sexual orientation as well. With this, it is really difficult to study adolescent sexuality. So why might that be? Why might it be hard to study adolescent sexuality? There are some methodological challenges for this topic. Yeah, adolescents are, unless you're talking about 18 or 19-year-olds, they're minors, right? Yeah, it might be taboo as well, and they might lie about it. So yeah, those three reasons are basically the three main reasons it's hard to study adolescent sexuality. Since they are minors, you do need informed consent from parents or guardians, especially when they're younger than 18. If it's taboo sexual behaviors in whatever culture or context that they're in, it might be really hard to get them not to lie about it. Even if it isn't taboo, they still might lie. So it's really funny, both adolescent sexuality research and adolescent drug use research, we see a lot of lying from adolescents. Whether you're asking them their frequency of sexual behaviors or drug use behaviors, some adolescents will report like to the extreme that they're having sex all the time or they're using drugs all the time, or they might report absolutely not, they're not using drugs, that they're not having sex. So we see a lot of lying at all different ways. It's really funny, one way, not really for sexual behaviors, but one way that we can catch adolescents lying about drug use behaviors is by making up drugs and then asking them if they've used them. So you make up a drug. I mean, first you have to make sure it's not actually slang for a drug that exists, but you make up a drug, you put it on a survey, and if you see a person saying, yes, I use all the fake drugs, you can kind of know, hey, I can throw out this data, this person's lying. So it's just kind of funny to see that behavior. But as a researcher, it does make it hard. This is one reason I'm glad that I don't do research on adolescent sexuality or drug use for adolescents, because of those methodological challenges. Looking at things like prosocial behavior, my biggest challenge is getting people not to overestimate how prosocial they are, or how helpful they are to other people. So that's a little bit easier. It's kind of the same problem versus sometimes people lie about a lot of sex or very little sex. So it's a challenge. So what can be done to fix those methodological concerns? Obviously, you can't fix it that they're minors or not. You need informed consent. But if it's taboo or if they might lie, what are some things you can do to help them respond honestly? To, let's say, a survey. A lot of surveys are used just because they're quick and easy for adolescents. A lie detector. I mean, you could try that. Interestingly, we don't talk about that in this class, but lie detectors are really unreliable, which is why they're not used in, say, court cases anymore, or if they are, the lawyer opposing the lie detector will have a lot of good cases to say, hey, you shouldn't use this. Yeah, lie detectors are really unreliable. There are, say, doing an MRI can actually be a lot better lie detector, but that's probably not going to come into much use except in research settings because using an MRI is so expensive. Maybe in 200 years from now, cops will have a lie detector and like point it at your head, and that doesn't sound great. Um, but yeah, anyway, making the survey anonymous is a really great idea. Drug tests can be challenging. They can be used, but then you need to have the parents' consent, the adolescents also to volunteer. Because for informed consent, even if though they're a minor and their parent might have said, hey, they can be involved in this study, the adolescent themselves also needs to give permission. So drug tests have been used. So yeah, but making the survey anonymous specifically for a survey is very helpful. And this is hard. You have to really make sure any survey should be anonymous. But if they're doing it in a school setting, so they're in a classroom, their friend next to them is taking a survey, their teacher is in front of the room, oftentimes they feel like that survey is connected to school in some way, even if you're a researcher coming in from an outside institution. So anytime I've done research in a school setting, the only thing we give, since I'm looking at like purpose and prosocial behavior, I will give the teachers like an average report of students think these are the things they would do to be pro-social or something like that. I wouldn't ever give one-to-one data. But students don't necessarily understand that. So making it really clear that it's anonymous, giving them that survey outside of the classroom setting. So maybe the teacher gives them a link and then after school, they go to that website and do the survey. That kind of thing can be really helpful. So observe what they're saying to peers. Yeah, that's another good method. So that's an observational method where you can look at how they talk to their peers. So you could think of this, you're kind of spying as a researcher, trying not to influence their behavior, but seeing what they're reporting to their peers, what they're reporting to maybe close peers or a wider group of peers, and how that is different from each other. A really interesting thing that we found in anthropology studies is there was a person named Margaret Mead who went to Samoa. Was this the 30s or 40s? You can look it up if this is interesting to you. Some really good findings came out of this and helped us do better at anthropology and qualitative interviews. But it was very interesting because a lot of the adolescents there, they lied about their sexual behaviors. And so Margaret Mead, basically all of the adolescents in this tribe that she was asking questions about their sexual behaviors to, they all kind of agreed to just mess up this researcher's research. So it's some white woman coming in to ask them about their sexual behaviors. So they just lied to her. They all agreed to just mess with this researcher. And so for years, a lot of Margaret Mead's research was kind of the basis for understanding sexual development in a different context than white Eurocentric America. But then when researchers went and followed up with those same individuals, they admitted to it once they were now adults. They were like, oh yeah, we totally lied to that person. So it's a big challenge in methods, and I probably went on way more tangents than I intended to, but it is a really funny, I guess for me, a methods person, a funny challenge to try and get good data on adolescent sexuality. So with that in mind, let's look at some findings on adolescent sexuality. And with that in mind, even though we do our best to try and not get lies, some of this might be down to, there's definitely some variance in here that comes from lying as well, or misunderstanding questions, things like that. So the average age of sexual initiation in adolescence in the US is about the age of 16, and there's usually about a year between a first and second sexual behavior on average. Again, this is normal distribution, so some people it's a few days, some people it's more than a year, right? So the timing of sexual behaviors has also changed. So adolescents and emerging adults are having less sex on average than previous generations. Now, some of that could be down to previous generations. The methods used to study them weren't as good as they are now. So there's that kind of question. Well, were previous generations actually having more sex than now? It's hard to say because they're not using exactly the same methods. They aren't using the same lie detecting methods that we are now. So with this, oral sex rates have increased across the board at every age. So why might that be? Well, I've gone on a couple tangents, so I'll just answer this one. So pregnancy isn't possible if oral sex is used exclusively, and so that's one reason that adolescents are defaulting to oral sex. Vaginal sex on average happens within about 6 months. Again, that's on average. It might be immediate, it might for some be years down the road. So STIs are still a risk. So things like herpes and chlamydia are still a risk with oral sex, but oral sex has become a lot more prevalent or popular, and its use is increasing in adolescents over previous generations. So with this, interestingly, adolescents who only engage in oral sex actually report increased pleasure, feeling like pleasure generally in life, feeling good about themselves, and less conflict with parents. So with this, it's actually a really interesting finding that adolescents, and let's say a parent comes to an adolescent and says, and asks them point blank, hey, are you having sex? Many adolescents don't consider oral sex to count as sex, so they feel they can honestly answer, no, I'm not having sex, so there's less of that conflict with parents if they're only having oral sex. So this also plays into that role too, that dynamic and bidirectional interaction between the parent and the child. So the parent feels less stressed that they have to have more of the sex talk with their adolescent, and the adolescent isn't getting judged or in trouble for their behaviors. So it's an interesting bidirectional relationship with that. All right, so with this, risk factors in adolescent sexuality, many adolescents, especially if they're having earlier sexual experiences, are not as emotionally prepared to handle those sexual experiences. So remember the limbic system, the amygdala, it's finishing up its myelination at about 12 and 13, but it's still not fully connected up like an adult's brain with the prefrontal cortex. So they're feeling more and stronger emotions, and that'll be the case when having early sexual experiences. So especially with early adolescence, there's early sexual experiences is considered earlier than 14. So drug use, delinquency, and school problems, also sexual assault and rape are higher risk for earlier sexual activities. Not using a condom, as well as pregnancy, is more common for earlier sexual experiences. So also being low SES or in the inner cities is also additional risk factors in early sexual experiences. So all these things are some of the problems that we've generally seen or stereotypically seen and wanted to avoid with adolescent sexual behaviors. But that being said, it doesn't mean that we can't protect adolescents from these kinds of risky sexual behaviors and these the risk factors and these outcomes. So family context is another big piece that affects if or when an adolescent is having sex. So parent hostility is correlated with earlier sexual activity and having multiple partners. So also having an older sibling that's also sexually active, that is, because that's similar to a peer. So if your peers are all having sex, you'll be more likely. If you have an older sibling who's sexually active, you will be a little more likely to be sexually active. Single parent homes, especially for girls, are correlated with earlier sexual activity as well. And so those risk factors really come from a lot of these early sexual experiences, because the adolescents haven't had as much time to learn how to regulate emotions, to try out more kind of relationship dynamics as well. So also, deviant peers in early adolescence might be an additional risk factor. Having lower or weaker self-regulation is a risk factor as well. So if from middle to late childhood, that self-regulation isn't improved, when you get into adolescence, you have these additional emotions driving you to do more risk-taking behaviors. That's also a risk factor. So impulsiveness is a big key, especially in sexual behaviors. Most first sexual experiences for adolescents are impulsive. So it interestingly generally comes at about the same time in a female's menstrual cycle. So because they're fertile at a period, and so they tend to act out sexually during that more fertile period with more impulsiveness. They still haven't learned the emotion regulation. And for a male, that cycle generally happens. It's a little more than 24 hours. I forget exactly if it's 26 or like 28 hours. But if those two times are matching up for, say, any partners, then it tends to lead to more impulsiveness. And when you have impulsiveness in a first sexual experience, it also tends to lead to pregnancy more often, or not using protection more often. So highly hormonally caused and emotional is generally a first sexual experience, especially in early adolescence. So that's why good comprehensive sex education is really helpful. It helps adolescents think and prepare, kind of like make a plan and be ready for, hey, when I do end up having sex, I need to remember using a condom or be using birth control or multiple things to prevent STIs as well as pregnancy. So getting them to have that in their plan beforehand means that when they make this impulsive act, hopefully they'll be slightly less impulsive and use some protection. But this is also why a lot of times a first sexual experience will lead to a pregnancy as well. Because biologically, a lot of that is just trying to make a baby because evolution, and the emotion regulation isn't quite there yet. All right, so what are some protective factors? What are some things that we can do to help prevent these kind of risky sexual behaviors and healthy sexual behaviors with adolescents? Well, parental warmth and support is really huge. So we saw parental conflict is a risk factor for early sexual behaviors or risk-taking sexual behaviors. Parent warmth and support does the opposite thing. It is a protective factor for these things. Got a comment. So my brother-in-law worked at a 7-Eleven close to a high school, and the most selling item amongst teenagers were pregnancy tests. Yeah, that's not uncommon, especially in places where there's not really good sexual education. That essentially we need to do a better job preparing adolescents for when they have sex, because on average, most of them will be having sex in adolescence. So we need to do a better job preparing them. So that isn't what they have to be purchasing. So maybe they're purchasing condoms more often, for example. But yeah, really good example. Where, if you don't mind, where was this at? Was this in Utah, or was this in another state, or maybe another country? So family connectedness is also a protective factor. Adolescent communication about sexuality with their parents is a really big protective factor. So this is something that we won't dive into a ton of information about comprehensive sex education, just because we don't quite have time. I wish we did. But communicating all the way from childhood about people's lives, about what they're feeling, their peer relationships, will end up leading to conversations about things like dating or sexual behavior. When media talks about having the talk, there shouldn't be the talk. There should be many, many talks with children, and then as they get into adolescence, you should still be having these talks as, say, parents. so that it's not just a one sit down, hey, let's get everything out about sex. Also, it's also part of that scaffolding. When a child is maybe 10, they're ready to hear a little bit more about things, versus when they're 16, now it might be too late. So you don't want to have the entire talk necessarily when they're 10, but giving them some information about proper boundaries and relationships, consent, things like that. And then aging it up as they get a little older. So, okay, so this example of the 7-Eleven was in Draper, Utah. Yeah, that's not surprising to me. Utah's sexual education programs are quite poor. So a really good example, actually, of what is being done and what should be done based in research. But that is one reason why pregnancy tests probably were the most commonly sold item. So parent monitoring. So with adolescents, parent monitoring is knowing what the adolescent is up to, what friends they're with, those kinds of things. Having a positive school climate is also very helpful. So if you have a positive school climate, we talked about this in relation to bullying and prosocial behaviors. If you have a positive school climate, you're going to have less bullying, you're going to have more positive interactions between peers. Adolescents will feel like they have support of faculty members, people they can turn to, and that will lead to less potentially risky sexual behaviors. So having high academic achievement is also correlated. Stronger self-regulation is correlated with less risky sexual behaviors. Prosocial norms and spirituality are all related to less risky adolescent sexuality. So, since we're talking about contraceptives, let's talk about, we will definitely come back to sexual minority attitudes and behaviors for LGBTQ plus identity development and sexual behaviors. But depending on our time, we might not talk about this today. So, they're going back to contraception and pregnancy tests. The US has a lot more adolescent pregnancy rates than other developed countries. So 6 times more pregnancies than adolescents in the Netherlands. And again, adolescents sometimes lie on their surveys, but it doesn't seem like we're more or less sexually active in the US than adolescents in those other countries. So since 2010, there has been lowering of teen pregnancy rates. So that's been good, but it's not as dramatic. It's not gone down to the point where other countries are. So we can see this here, groups split up by ethnicity, and then the births per 1,000 females aged 15 to 19. So it's like middle to late adolescence. So this is still not great compared to other countries, so it's good to see a little decrease, but hopefully we see more. So why is this? Well, I think you can tell from the conversation, is childbearing in other countries is really seen as an adult activity. It's talked about more openly in many other cultures and communities. There's also more clear messages about sexual behaviors in a lot of other countries. A lot of other cultures do a better job saying that sexual behavior that leads to child rearing is an adult behavior. But there's a lot more clear messages about adolescent sexual activity not being so negative or not being stereotyped as negatively as we do in the US. There's also better access to family planning services in many other places in the world. So with this, consequences for adolescent pregnancy, higher risk for preterm and low birth weights. I think we talked about this very early on in the class. When you have a very young mother, say like 13 or 14, there's a lot more likelihood that maybe that person will be hiding that from peers and parents and not seeking good prenatal care, not knowing what to do, not being given the support, especially if they're trying to hide it. Also increased mother depression, school dropout, and that combines with other risk factors like having low SES to make things have really poor outcomes for both the parent and the child. So comprehensive sex education is pretty much the best option. So essentially comprehensive, well, I think this first one is really short, so maybe we'll watch this one. But this one is really good too, because it looks at how comprehensive sex education would actually be done in different classrooms. Maybe we'll watch that one if we have time. I think this one's a little bit longer though. Okay, I think this one's fine. So this shows essentially what comprehensive sex education might look like in a elementary school classroom versus middle school versus high school. So comprehensive sex education overlaps a lot with socio-emotional learning, in that some things you need to have to manage a good sexual relationship are responsibility, respect for other people, understanding boundaries, being able to regulate your emotions a little better. So a lot of these are socio-emotional learning capacities that can be learned early on in childhood. And so now in adolescence, they're now just applied to a dating or sexual relationship. So you need to be able to know how to be respectful of people's boundaries, how to speak and communicate about your needs and things like that. So, as well as being okay with saying no and know that it's okay to say that as well. And then being listened to, obviously. So let's watch this one, and then we'll probably end on this subject, I think.
You know, it's called a vagina.
Ah! The wounds are probably good, but not.
Well, I know, and then you just... What do you think we're going to talk about today?
Sexual intercourse.
All right, get it out now, all your giggles, whatever you need to.
Healthy sexuality education encompasses all the different components, aspects of one's sexuality. So parents are doing the primary work by communicating their values.
Could you tell me about sex?
About sex.
And then teachers and other professionals are providing young people with the information they need and the opportunity and spaces they need to discuss those things with their peers. Sex education.
So the writing here is really a key part of comprehensive sex education, that sex education should start in kindergarten and extend all the way through public school. And what we'll see is, what does that actually mean? What does that mean that you're telling or talking about in a first grade or kindergarten classroom? Because you're not having an anatomy discussion in, at least not the same anatomy discussion you're going to be having for a high school. You're not going to do that in first grade. You might say something like respecting other people's privates in first grade or second grade, versus in high school, you're probably going to have diagrams of genitals and explaining what's happening during puberty. Actually, that should probably be in middle school, but just as some examples.
Education in kindergarten should focus on empathy and narrating emotional experiences.
Fidel, when are you glad? What makes you glad?
Doing cartwheels?
Doing cartwheels makes you glad.
Sex education in elementary school should be an extension of that and focus on how we treat each other and that it matters.
We're going to get explicit really quick.
So hopefully this now class, it's jumping forward quite a bit. But hopefully you see from that interaction in, say, a kindergarten or first grade classroom, you might not look at that and say, oh, this looks like sex education, because it really doesn't. It doesn't look like we traditionally think of sex education, but it's building the relationship skills, building their socio-emotional learning skills to the point that they can have sexual relationships in adolescence and through adulthood. So that's the point, and that's what we're talking about with comprehensive sex education. When someone says, well, we should do comprehensive sex education, they're not saying, hey, we should have the talk when they are in first grade. So we're saying, hey, we should build the skills so that they're ready to have the talk with other adults and their peers in a respectful manner so that they can be prepared for sexual behaviors. So that's what comprehensive sex education is. The talk honestly shouldn't exist as a thing. It should be, like I said, lots of little communications, getting things like parents' values out early on, things like respecting other people early on. And then now we're going to see like middle school, high school kind of class right here.
We're going to talk about anatomy. You ready for that? Okay. Sex education in middle school should include puberty education that is medically accurate and comes from credible resources, as well as how that information can be applied to the social dynamics that they're experiencing. Sex education in high school should include additional information about safe sexuality practices and also continued practice on how to apply that information to the complexities of social dynamics. So students have the opportunity in a school setting to talk about these issues, learn about them with the very people who they may be exploring those things with. And that's something that you can't really create in your home.
It also, there are like sex education resources that can be done through online programs, but a lot of positive and good sex education programs have a lot of communication and interaction between adolescents. I'm definitely diving into this subject more today than I generally do in a class, probably because yesterday I was browsing Reddit and there was a post, someone did an Ask Reddit post about what was a really strange thing that you thought about sex or sex education, or that you were taught in sex education classes. And some of the things that people were told were absolutely incorrect and really confused them and made it really hard for them to have good sexual relationships until they were into adulthood. And that's really a disservice to adolescents who are probably going to be engaging in some kind of sexual behaviors. So giving them the appropriate tools to do that is really important to me as someone who focuses on adolescent and early adult development. So there's a couple other resources here if you want to learn more about comprehensive sex education. Some of the big things are also access to contraceptive methods, life options approach, so looking at different options for life. And this is also a good time to be talking about that in adolescence, with them looking at their identity. What are they going to do with their lives? Showing them there's all these different options. And then community involvement and support. It can be really hard if a school wants to have, say, comprehensive sex education, but the parents are all really afraid of that. They don't want people to be talking about even anatomically correct and medically accurate puberty information. That can be really, really difficult. For example, this is Utah in early 2019. There was finally a change in the law about sex education in Utah. So until 2019, it was exclusively abstinence-only sex education, which, if you look at this video and look at the resources that they link there, is really not useful or really not good, as we maybe can see, because many teenagers are buying pregnancy tests at the 7-Eleven during lunch break from high school. That's what I'm guessing in my mind. This is what they're doing on their lunch break. They're going, their friends are with them, and they go and test. But so some highlighted things is still at this time. Oop, I guess I can't actually highlight that. But still, even with the change in law to allow more medically accurate discussions, allow broader discussions about things like consent, the new laws are still worded to stress abstinence to young people in Utah. So with this, it talks about how a lot of teachers report that they will probably skip talking about things like consent so that they don't overstep. So the law is still, like, while it's now permitted, and how ridiculous is that? Is that now it's permitted to talk about things like consent or healthy sexual behaviors for adolescents, but still written into the law is that abstinence-only program should be kind of the focusing on chastity. As you can tell, this is kind of a touchy subject for me. I didn't have sex education in Utah, but I did have very similar sex education myself in Indiana. So seeing the behaviors for adolescents there, pregnancies, risky sexual behaviors, and how seeing the research of comprehensive sex education and how it's worked so well in so many parts of the world, and then seeing this kind of pushback on this good science, not just Utah, but also Indiana and other places, it gets me really frustrated. But it is hard to change policymakers' minds on things. One of the best things to do to change policymakers' minds is show them a couple good examples, like actually bring in some adolescents or young adults who went through comprehensive sex education and have them explain their own story. Like, I didn't understand this, but through comprehensive sex education, this happened, this happened, this happened, versus my friend who had abstinence only. That kind of thing can actually be really helpful for a policymaker to change their mind. There's a lot of other factors that go into policymaking, obviously, as well. So definitely talked about this a lot longer than I intended to and haven't really left much room for questions, but definitely are there questions right now about comprehensive sex education? I've left these additional links here, maybe a good question paper if you're interested in it as well. And then next time we will start off on talking about sexually minority adolescents and attitudes, the sexual development of LGBTQ plus individuals. So questions though on the subjects we've talked about today? All right, I do hope we can spend enough time to do these subjects justice next time as well. All right, so thank you for being here today. Hopefully in my ranting I made sense. This is coming from research, so, and I have taught this subject quite a few times, but definitely went into that in more detail than I intended to today, but important topic. All right, well, have a great day, and thanks for being here. I will see you all on Thursday.